Welcome, everyone. Today marks the last of 3 webinars. The topic today is claims management. I'm Amber Hardwick, General Counsel of OAC. I'm a former construction litigator and current chair of the construction law section of the Washington State Bar. And I have a good deal of experience with claims, construction claims after they have reached the stage of lawsuits. But with me are 2 people who have substantial experience with managing claims well before that. Dan Chandler is the Senior Vice President of OAC. He's also the Chair of the Board of Directors. He's got 40 years of experience in the built environment and has represented private and public sector clients from large to small, but most notably right now, he is helping a very large technology sector client move from project suspension to project restart. We also have Kevin Fromm, a senior project manager with OAC. He has 12 years of experience managing both large and small projects, and most notably right now, he is working on several essential projects. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thanks, Amber.
Let's start with a bit of a philosophical question to start. Dan, what is the purpose of construction management?
Construction management is really what we do, Amber, of course, and we're managing the complex process of designing and delivering projects for our clients. So we're really owner's agents, whether it's a public entity, a private developer, or even a not-for-profit. We manage the work on their behalf.
It seems to me, just from a former litigator's perspective, once it reaches the court, you're no longer managing a claim, you're just trying to clean it up. And so I know lawyers appreciate what you do. You two also have a unique perspective because you have exposure to how many parties are responding to COVID-19. So let's start with drawing on your perspective about how claims have changed in light of COVID-19. Kevin, can you go ahead and start?
Certainly. So since COVID-19 happened and started to impact our projects, what we've started to see is just the work slow down a little bit. Crews have been smaller as people have been sick or potentially sick and avoiding exposure to other workers. Also, some of the regulations and procedures that are in place are impacting how quickly they can move through things. And we're seeing a lot of fear in some of the crews that are at work and uncertainty. So it's a pretty fine balance between being able to stay productive and on site and making sure that people are wanting to be there and working safely and productively.
I know morale is a component of productivity, right? Are you doing anything or seeing people do anything on sites that are helping with morale?
It's been tough to do much as a group as we normally would in the past, but it's definitely something that we're looking for every opportunity to just say thank you to everybody that's on site working continuously. You know, the traditional team lunch that we might do is pretty much out of the question at this point, but we're looking at other ways to just, you know, saying thank you goes a long ways with a lot of people.
Dan, there are always claims on construction projects, schedule adjustments, contract sum changes. How has claims management changed since COVID-19 from your perspective?
Well, I think it's been such a huge disruption, Amber, really, that was so unexpected. You know, it's nothing like anything I've ever experienced in my 40 years. So it's having an impact on labor productivity. It's certainly having an impact on schedule. It's having somewhat of an impact on the predictability of deliveries, although we haven't seen too much of that yet. So I think the unpredictable nature of it and the severity is beyond any precedent that I've experienced, for sure.
When you're talking about unpredictability of deliveries, is that supply chain issues? Is that what you're talking about?
Correct. You know, on all my projects, including the large technology project, the supply chain was pretty full for the next few weeks. What we're beginning to worry about, we're certainly tracking, is deliveries from overseas, because there's certainly impacts in China and Europe and even in Canada. We've got a steel supplier from Eastern Canada that we're having a pretty close watch at.
The stay home, stay healthy order certainly changed the construction landscape. It sounds like Kevin's projects were able to continue on, but Dan, you have a couple of suspended projects. Did you still have you seen any change orders actually signed or issued on those projects?
We have, Amber. The change orders that have been executed so far are really for the direct recognizing and acknowledging and compensating the contractor for the direct costs associated with shutdown. So, for example, you know, one of the large projects I'm on will be shut down for about 6 weeks, and so there's standby time for equipment. There's certainly additional PPE that's being procured and some additional medics. So there's been a relatively small change order executed with our contractors to acknowledge that additional cost so far.
Kevin, are you seeing change orders getting signed already as well?
No, not yet. We haven't seen, we're not to that point yet. So our contractors that I'm working with have followed their contractual responsibilities and provided notice as they're impacted. But for us, it's too early at this point to be able to quantify what the impact is or what the change should be. So we're acknowledging that there is an impact, and we're holding tight on issuing any change orders.
You know, I'm curious, since your project wasn't necessarily suspended because it was an essential project, or at least the one I'm thinking of, do you expect to still see delay claims?
Yes, we certainly expect to see delay claims, and the two of the projects I'm working on are deemed essential under the governor's proclamation. But that doesn't mean that we're not impeded in any way. So we've seen crew sizes reduced drastically as people have been sick, as I mentioned before. And it's just slower getting in and out of the site. There's people that just don't want to come to work. It's considered essential, and we're requiring or can require contractors to be on site. But on one of my projects, it's a public client, and they actually gave the contractor the option to continue to come to work or not, even though the project is essential. Or I guess they opened it up to they would award days related to loss of productivity and slow work.
Can I ask, what was the outcome on that?
It's still open at this point, so it's a tricky situation to kind of work through. And it was letters that went back and forth, and there was conversations. But right now, the contractor is continuing work on site. It is just at a slower pace, but it is effectively going forward, and they're doing a really good job of managing the work that they can get done with the crew that they have available. Frankly, I'm impressed with what they're able to get done compared to what we initially thought might happen.
Now, I know from prior conversations with you both that you have some insights about newly bid projects and projects that weren't quite into construction. What are you seeing with that type of project? Dan, can you lead off? I know you both have perspective on that.
It's an interesting question. One of our clients bid a job in early March, and then within 2 weeks, the governor issued his stay home, stay healthy order before the contract was executed. So this bid happened right before that, and then this change condition occurred. They provided notice to the potential client before the project was even executed, or the contract was even executed. And some back and forth discussions took place. Ultimately, they executed the contract with the bid previously issued, but it was a tricky couple of weeks where the contractor was frankly considering withdrawing their bid. not knowing what the future would hold. So this is early in the stay home, stay healthy order timeframe, and not really sure if he'd be able to have the subcontractors honor their bids or the suppliers. So he was quite concerned.
Some follow-up questions for context. Was that a project that was previously defined as an essential project, so they were able to sign the contract and start moving?
Well, it was an essential project, yes. So I'm not sure if it's underway yet or not. The contract, it's my understanding the contract's executed and things are beginning to move. But one of the interesting things about that project on the critical path is steel detailing and fabrication. And the steel detailer is located in India, and India is shut down too. And the ability of steel detailers to work remotely in India is much less than it is in the United States. So the steel detailer is still standing down, waiting to go back to work.
But in your case, it sounds like the contractor ended up honoring their price and signing the contract. Kevin, do you have a similar example?
I do. One of the projects that I'm working on, we actually just signed a guaranteed maximum price with our contractor last week. And going through the bidding process, it's a general contractor construction manager project, and so there's bid packages that they put out. And some of the bid packages bid early on during this, and some of them are yet to bid. But a few of them are yet to bid. But there was a lot of question on how do we handle this. Construction start date for that project, shovels in the ground, is May 18th. So when we did the first round of bid packages, we understood that May 18th was after May 4th. And we proceeded under the assumption that the stay-at-home order would be lifted. That project also is a little bit interesting in that it is classified as an essential project, just being the nature of it. And so it's proceeding forward. And, what was interesting too is bids came in for different packages. We saw some stuff that's really unheard of right now, or you don't really see. So one of our packages, our mechanical package, actually had 7 bidders. Which right now in this environment with how busy everybody is, you just don't see. So what was the cause of that? Was that related to COVID? We don't really know. It could be possibly concern with subcontractors of how much backlog they have and do they have enough to carry them through this. So we saw a great turnout. We were very pleased. The contractor that we're working on with that project did a fantastic job.
Did the owner in that one include any contingencies or anything to cover for COVID?
No, we didn't include any contingencies to cover it. We're still watching as this project unfolds. So we're managing the situation, and frankly, we're waiting to see what happens tomorrow, even with the governor's announcement on lifting restrictions further. So right now, we're still slated to start on May 18th. We will deal with change orders as they arise for loss of productivity or delays, and we'll just see what comes. We're not handling it any differently than our ongoing project at this point.
I think we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about force majeure at some point during this call. So I know we have a slide. Scott, can you put up the force majeure slide? I can define from a legal perspective, this is from Black's Law Dictionary, what force majeure is. And it might be a phrase nobody's ever even thought of until recent events. But as you can see, it's an event or effect that's neither anticipated nor controlled. And I'd like to hear from each of you about whether you're seeing any dispute about whether COVID-19 constitutes a force majeure event. I'm sorry, I should call someone. Kevin, why don't you take that one?
I don't think there's any reason to contest that this is force majeure. I think by definition of what this is, it is nothing other than. So there's other things that come into play, that can come into play as a result of how you handle the situation. But unless somebody really knew that we were going to have a pandemic in early 2020 that would affect the whole state and the whole, well, I guess the whole world. This would definitely be defined as force majeure.
Dan, do you agree?
Oh, absolutely. This is the classic force majeure event or black swan event for sure. And that's the way it's being treated by the contractors that I'm working with and our clients.
Mm-hmm.
It's really how to navigate it and reduce the cost of delivery is really where we're putting a lot of effort.
Just, from a legal perspective, force majeure tends to be strictly construed by some courts, some states courts. So the terminology used in the force majeure clause will have a lot of sway about whether COVID-19 and the government shutdown constitutes force majeure. Just one, but in general, this is the kind of event no one can anticipate. The remedy for force majeure is generally a non-compensable schedule extension. So we're all familiar with that. I'm wondering if that's how it's playing out. I know that, Dan, you have experience in the private sector right now. Can you speak to that?
And on the large technology project that I'm spending a lot of time on today, they're not enforcing the time but no money, but we're in the midst of buying out the project. We're in the midst of negotiating multiple guaranteed maximum prices. So there's new knowledge that's coming into play right now. And so far it's been very amicable. It's been a lot of effort by the general contractors and right down to the tradespeople to develop techniques in their job hazard analysis so that they can execute the work as efficiently as possible and mitigate the cost impact. Whether that cost impact is borne by a subcontractor, the general contractor, or ultimately the owner, it's really the focus on doing a better job. And frankly, we're seeing a huge amount of cooperation in the general contracting and the subcontracting community. It's almost open source code on how do you screen people on the job sites, how do you execute work effectively.
Kevin, on public sector projects, is that how it's playing out for you? Time, no cost?
I would say every agency is going to be a little bit different, but specifically with one of the clients I'm working with, it is looked at as a time but no cost situation. So, there's other factors that go along with it. That's the cost with the contractor, but there's soft costs that are associated with. There's a number of different paths we can go down and talk about, opportunity costs, just your supervision that you have, your direct supervision, and a number of things. So we're looking at a lot of different avenues, and I guess I'm fortunate to work with a client and contractors that have a collective goal of moving these projects forward efficiently, with as little impact to everybody as possible.
Even when it's not called force majeure, you raise a good point there. Even when it's not called force majeure, there are bases for claims. And I know that you guys have a couple of pillars that I want to talk about, because when I was litigating, I would think about the foundation for my argument as a three-legged stool, right? The stool's ability to support weight, the argument's ability to support weight, dependent on each leg of that stool being on solid foundation. So if you could articulate 3 pillars of claims management, what would those be, Kevin?
The first one that we all need to be aware of when we start these conversations and discussing these issues is you have to know what's in your contract. You need to read it front to back, top to bottom, understand all the clauses that are in it, understand what your actions or the impact that your actions might have. So one, know your contract. Second, everybody's impacted as we start this. It's not one group or one side, so it's important to sit down and be reasonable and creative in mitigating costs. Cost impacts, time impacts, quality impacts, There's a lot of things that could happen, and at the end, everybody wants a project that they're happy with. So, and then thirdly, I'd say an important pillar to understand is know your project's scope and status at the time it was shut down, or the onset of the event. So documentation is going to be key. Hopefully we keep this, all of these claims, everybody keeps their claims away from attorneys and litigation, but certainly some are going to go that path. And it's important to document exactly where you're at. Know your schedule, have pictures, have reports. We don't know today what's going to be valuable when this all starts to settle out. So those are the three pillars that we talked about. And I think, Dan, you'd probably agree with those. Maybe you have something to add.
No, I agree with you wholeheartedly.
Well, let's dig into those a little bit, though. So when you say understand the contract, Kevin, what are you looking for? Can you elaborate on what you would look for in the contract?
Sure. So do you have a force majeure clause in your contract? How are delays handled? What are the notice requirements from your contractor, from the other entities? What are other clauses that may come into play? Is there emergency action clause that might become part of this? Is there acceleration clauses that might become part of this, depending on how you handle the situation or what the needs of the project are? So it's again, you need to read and understand all of the clauses and all of the provisions in the contract. And I would suggest don't do it alone. There's a lot in there that's tough to understand. Consult your attorney if you have questions. But yeah, that's force majeure would be the place I'd start. Handling delays would be next. And notice, watch your notice. If it says to send an email, send an email. If it says to send a fax, and do it in the time frame that it specifies.
I know several people have been surprised that faxes are still referenced in contracts these days. I want to underscore the notice provisions, though, because this is something we've all talked about on, Dan and Kevin and I have talked about, and there's some jurisprudence in Washington and in other states saying that notice provisions are strictly construed. So as Kevin said, if it says send it by homing pigeon, you send it by homing pigeon. Dan, I've heard you reference that force majeure clauses cut both ways. I wanted to make sure that you had an opportunity to highlight that here, because what did you mean by that?
Right. And we certainly talked about it internally here at OAC with some of our clients that could be severely negatively impacted on the downstream effects. For example, hotels. We have a couple of hotel clients that if their business has changed completely and the cost of the work has gone up substantially, might they be able to terminate the contract under a force majeure provision? So we certainly considered that. And we consulted with our client to see if they wanted to. So far, none of our owner clients have elected to terminate contracts or change them in any significant way. But we certainly considered it, and we talked about it internally so that we could advise them what their options are under the circumstances.
I want to stick with you while we talk about the second pillar a little bit. I believe it said be reasonable and collaborative. Scott, can you throw that pillars slide up again? Dan, what does this mean to you?
Well, even if let's take the time but no money approach to this problem. I think most contractors and most of us acknowledge that there's going to be some cost impact in order, at least in the short run, when contractors and subcontractors are adhering to new safety rules. There's additional staff on the job. There's some concern about productivity impact. So even if an owner grants time but no money, I think it behooves owners and architects and contractors to be as creative and collaborative as they can to reduce the cost of delivery. And that's really the most important thing. And it's amazing that how creative people are coming up with to keep 6 feet apart. and to smooth the flow of health screenings onto job sites. The use of technology, the use of staggered starts, the use of staggered lunches and breaks, the distribution of hand washing equipment, you know, trying different types of face coverings that are more comfortable, that help people be productive. And then even on the architecture side, there are design decisions that can be made even partway through to have less labor intensive materials, allow for second shifts to distribute staff. And for our clients with occupied buildings, that may require them to have people on site. One of the things I heard is of a school client, because the kitchen is closed, that the cooks have food and they have skills, and so they're actually providing meals for the construction staff on an occupied remodel project. So that's their way of contributing and helping where they can, and so that's creative use, low cost for our client, and maybe high value for the productivity on the project.
I like the approach that we're all in this together, because decisions made now can have ramifications down the road. And I know that we talked earlier, Kevin, you had mentioned something about acceleration and holding folks to the current schedule. If you remember what I'm talking about, do you mind bringing that forward for this group?
Sure. I think one of the important things to consider when you sit down and start going through how you're going to handle the situation as a team, of course, is, and no matter what group you're with or side of the table you're on, whether you're the contractor, a subcontractor, an owner, or design professional, I think it's important to understand what your ideal outcome is, what you can live with, and what's likely for you, and that's going to guide you a little bit. So if a project is delayed because it was shut down, it was non-essential, or it was essential, and there's a reduced workforce, there's additional measures that slow the project down. If the end date is immovable, there's acceleration that comes into play to catch that up. So, you effectively, you can't add time. And so if you can't add time, you need to accelerate, and you can do that in creative ways, through overtime and double shifts and third shifts. But ultimately, overtime and all these additional measures have a potential to cause another effect downstream. So it's I guess very important to pay attention and understand the ramifications of your decisions, think through what might be a result, how you would respond to that, and what the result of that response might be. So acceleration is one that could quickly come into play if there's an obvious impact, but the end date can't change.
I feel like claims management needs to discuss how to navigate hostile or contentious relationships. And Dan, do you have some insights about how you approach that?
Yeah, yes, Amber. One of the things we're seeing is projects that may have been a little contentious pre-COVID only got harder. So if a general contractor or a subcontractor was experiencing cost overruns in excess of their contract sum and they were headed to lose money, they always come with their hand out. So that's the brew point, the genesis of a claim. So when you throw COVID-19 disruption to a project, it only makes it more complicated. So back to the third pillar is really documentation is super important. And so we've been working with all of our project managers to make sure they've got a really good snapshot of what happened. In the case of Washington, the governor's stay home, stay healthy order was really the beginning. So it kind of happened all in one day. Mm-hmm. So what was the status of the project everywhere? What was the status, work in place, schedule status, and then cost status, whether it's a cost reimbursable contract like GCCM or a lump sum contract. What was the last invoice? In some projects, we had the contractor literally send a mid-month invoice as a snapshot of cost as of the day of the stay home, stay healthy order.
I know lawyers will appreciate the documentation aspect, because when I was a litigator, I would always approach a construction claim by separating entitlement from the request itself, so the amount of time or the amount of cost. So in this case, there might be entitlement, but there might be just a tangle of costs thrown in there, a tangle of concurrent delays, and having that baseline or that snapshot, as you called it, could be really valuable. When it comes to, oh, I'm sorry, do you want to add to that, Dan?
No, that's fine.
When it comes to baseline setting, I wanted to ask Kevin about what you're doing, what you're seeing on your projects about setting a baseline.
We're taking the most up-to-date schedule as provided by our contractors and making sure that actualized start and finish dates are real, that logic between activities is real, and so that as things are impacted, we can watch that unfold. And I like to compare every week's update. We do 6-week look-aheads or 3-week look-aheads, whatever your project is using. And I like to use the previous week as a baseline to measure the current, most recent update against. But certainly establishing one, whatever day you were impacted, whether that be March 23rd or March 25th or extenuating circumstances, what changed, but set a place and time, make sure that what's actually started is accurately reflected. You can prove that with pictures and reports to substantiate that, and then hold on to that. And it's going to be something that you refer back to a number of times as you try to determine what the total impact is. But certainly take a close look at logic in your schedule right now, and look at different ways of sequencing or phasing that may be advantageous that you didn't think about before to minimize some of the impact.
We have a couple of questions, and I apologize for just now noticing them, but I wonder if you guys wouldn't mind if I tossed a few of these questions right at you. Sure. One of them is, how could an owner claim there is no cost if the governor's order requires special precautions and PPE that were not required previously? Dan, do you want to take that one?
I'd take that. I don't think that's any different than say a really severe weather event. The kind of the first response from an owner, more so in the public sector, look, time but no money. Now that doesn't preclude the contractor from coming back and asking for money in a severe weather event. The cost to recover from the event, or the direct costs associated with snow removal, or I guess damage to structure would likely be a builder's risk claim. But in my experience, if the contractor is impacted on cost, you can expect a claim. It could be amicable or it could be adversarial, but I've never seen a contractor that would lose money on an event like this and not request additional compensation.
Here's another question. Thanks for taking that as if you were right on your toes there, Dan. This is from Dave Hawkins. He says, I have heard in some channels that force majeure was intended only for the contractor. I have seen some contractors saying the owner ordered a shutdown or changes in the work. Let's take that in turn. I will say, in answer to the first question about whether force majeure is intended only for contractors, depends on the language of your contract, right? Force majeure clause isn't a common law clause. It's either in your contract or it doesn't exist. It's also called in the AIA documents an excusable delay clause. And in the A201 AIA document, it only is for the contractor to make a claim for additional time. So that does work one way. But I'll pitch to you guys the second question. I have seen some contractors saying the owner ordered a shutdown or changes in the work. Kevin, have you seen anything like that on any of your projects?
Not that we ordered a shutdown or that the owner ordered a shutdown. We actually have I think a pretty unique situation, and I mentioned it just briefly before, is the projects that I'm working on are considered essential facilities, and so they get to continue or are allowed to continue under the proclamation. But my client actually acknowledged the force majeure clause, acknowledged the impact, and allowed the contractor to be part of the decision and make the decision whether they continue or not. And so they didn't force them to stop, and they didn't force them to continue. They gave them the option, and I think it was a very creative and a good way to be a partner with their whole project team, is to say, okay, look, we know this is an impact to you. We know that the contract says there's no cost involved in this, but if you'd like to continue, if that's the best path forward, then you are allowed to do that. But if you don't, or if you are impacted from a time standpoint, we will still grant you days. So I think the client that I'm working with really put some thought into working with their contractor on their project.
Dan, same question to you. Have you had any owner, or had the allegation that any owner has ordered a shutdown or changes in the work?
No, our clients on the projects that I'm working on, it's been, again, very collaborative. What's the best move today? Should we slow down? Should we move the end date? Should we try to hold it? Or, should we just stick with our plan to execute it on schedule? So far it's been flexible. No client of mine has forced a shutdown.
Here's a question from Joseph Knight. Would you suggest tracking a COVID category in your OAC minutes? Dan?
I would say yes. I think even in a case of a client who says, look, time but no money, I think we don't want to invite claims. We don't want to open up a checkbook that we pay everybody everything, but I think acknowledging it and acknowledging the impact is a smart move. However you do it makes sense. We are doing that on a job. So on one project where we've actually executed change orders, we've actually added a chart of accounts directly associated with that, with those cost impacts.
What do you mean by a chart of accounts?
Well, it's really line items within a cost reimbursable contract. So when the invoice comes in, it's somewhat like a schedule of values type invoice, but it's really actual cost. So in that case, it's because it's cost reimbursable and it's actual cost spend, it can be delineated and shown.
From my perspective, after the formal notice has been given in whatever manner the contract requires, it would be fine to track it in the OAC minutes. And in fact, it's a good way to be collaborative and creative and get problems out before they become major problems. On public projects, Kevin, are you seeing these tracked in OAC minutes, or do you have an opinion one way or the other?
I am seeing them tracked, and I think it's very wise to do so. And really along the lines of what you just said, Amber, is when it's in the minutes and you talk about it every week, if that's how often your meetings are, it's something that you are continuously revisiting to make sure that you're going down the best path for the project. So I think if you ignore it, you don't talk about it, you forget about it, you miss out on good opportunity to do better.
And I would just add, I think because the rules keep changing, the essential projects were released to start. Well, now we've got a phase 1 construction start. The nuance of what's allowed under DOSH regulations and under the governor's orders it keeps changing a little bit, and those subtle changes can be really significant on labor productivity. So discussing it every week is a smart move. What do we know today? What do we expect to happen in the future? And how does that drive our decisions about what work to execute and what work to delay?
Mm-hmm. Well, you mentioned earlier, Dan, that you're not seeing supply chain issues quite yet, but that's one of the ways to make sure that you're on top of it when and if that happens, right?
We ask our contractors to track their supply chain very carefully, very far out. We're just doubling down on that now. And some projects were requiring to show state of origin, where these things are actually done, and then to track back to the factories and suppliers and make sure they're still working and look for alternatives. So far, like I said, we haven't seen it, but we are worried about it.
Here are a couple more questions from Adela. Any idea of percentage reduction in efficiency? At least in your, on the myriad of claims that you're seeing, are you seeing people say 3%, 5%, 100% inefficient? Dan?
I've seen one analysis, and it really wasn't terribly rigorous, but it indicated 10 to 15% labor productivity impact. And again, this is just anecdotal. I did talk to the contractor about it, and it was in a cooperative cost reimbursable public contract. It was a GCCM contract. Just like Kevin's client said, look, we'll let you change the schedule. So the idea was, if we keep going, what are we going to spend on labor productivity loss? Are we better off sliding the schedule to the right, hoping that the virus and the infection levels would drop off enough and we'd be able to work more productively? And then the other conversation I had with a contractor about bidding right now, I asked him what he expects. Would you advise clients to bid, and what's the effect on labor productivity knowing what they know now? And the answer was there could be, 3 or 5% total cost impact due to labor productivity losses. But then he also said that given the likely sellers market that owners are going to see, that'll likely get offset by reductions in fees and offsets in other areas. So his initial take was there'd be no direct cost effect for public owners.
I imagine the inefficiencies and the percentage will connect to the size of the project and complexity of the project. Do you guys agree? You agree, Dan?
Yeah, definitely. Some activities aren't affected at all. If you're driving a dump truck or loading it with an excavator, there's no impact. If you're laying tile or hanging lead line drywall and I need a partner that's 4 feet away from you, that's significantly impacted.
Here's a question I'm going to pitch at you, Kevin, because you've been quiet. So this is as owner's rep or from a legal aspect, what types of documentation are you requesting from contractors to substantiate delay claims related to COVID?
Well, as owner's reps, I would say that we're not requesting anything different than what the contract already requires. So, we want notice. We want to know what the schedule was before. We want to see a time impact analysis on the schedule to really determine what the issue was or the impact was. And from a cost standpoint, I think it's going to depend on who the client is, who the owner is, on what level of detail you want to get into with cost. There's a number of ways to handle it, but I'm going to defer to the contract in most situations as far as what is required. And then when I'm reviewing a time or a cost claim, I like to have enough information to convince me to a reasonable degree that what is presented is accurate. And that just varies from project to project.
We have so many more questions, and I'm not going to be able to get to all of them, but I do want to ask this other one from Jason Lang. What about projects with access like scaffolding and equipment that are all based on time-based rental? Does that change how you approach it? Dan?
Well, in one case, we knew we were going to shut down the project a few days ahead, and there's quite a bit of equipment on this large project. Tower cranes, excavators, there's a conveyor belt. And frankly, our contractors went straight to the suppliers and said, if it's mobile rental equipment, a telehandler or something like that, they said, well, come and get it. Well, the rental shops don't want it back. So they said, okay, we'll waive rental. And then even in the case of large cranes, we did get a kind of a standby rate. So it wasn't a complete abeyance of rental on a month-to-month basis, but the suppliers were pretty amenable. They get it, better a discount than nothing. So they're trying to play ball too.
Good. I hate to cut you off, but we have squandered another perfectly good 45 minutes. Thank you all for coming. I hope you guys enjoyed it as much as we did. I love talking to these guys. Be responsible, take care of yourselves, be healthy. There were questions we weren't able to answer in today's talk, and we will be wrapping those up and sending out those answers tomorrow. So if you have follow-up questions, check out our website, connect with us on social media, or feel free to contact us at our email addresses. Thank you, Dan and Kevin. Thank you all.
Thanks,
Thank you.